Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Parashat Beshalach. Huge amount in this week's parasha. So let's get going straight away. So once again, thanks to Jonathan for supplying the parasha summary. And here we go, Beshalach in a nutshell. Soon after allowing the children of Israel to depart from Egypt, Pharaoh chases after them, and the Israelites are trapped between Pharaoh's armies and the sea. God tells Moshe to raise his staff over the water. The sea splits to allow the Israelites to pass through and then closes over the pursuing Egyptians. Moses and the children of Israel sing a song of praise and gratitude to God. In the desert, thereafter, the people suffer thirst and hunger, and they repeatedly complain to Moses and Aaron. God miraculously sweetens the bitter waters of Marah, causes manna to fall each morning and quails each evening, and later has Moses bring forth water from a rock by striking it with his staff. The children of Israel are instructed to gather a double portion of manna on Fridays, as none will descend on Shabbat. Some disobey and go to gather manna on the seventh day, but find nothing. Aaron preserves a small quantity of manna in a jar as a testimony for future generations. In Rephidim, the people are attacked by the Amalekites, who are defeated by Moses' prayers and an army raised by Joshua. So, let's now have a look at the beautiful picture by Yoram Ra'anan, Israeli artist, mentioned before. And of course, there we see his beautiful depiction of the splitting of the Red Sea. And the contours of the water as walls and the people standing below. Just imagine the scene. And we'll see later that the braver ones took the first steps and others followed. I guess you had to have guts and a lot of faith. And that is what happened there. So, Parashat Beshalach has a huge amount in it. And I used to wonder, why so much? Surely the main theme is the splitting of the sea and the song. And in fact, that is the Torah reading from the beginning of Beshalach till the splitting of the sea on the seventh day of Pesach. But you know, even the seventh day of Pesach has a little bit more than that. And we need to understand why, we need to understand what this is about. So, without any further ado, we will go to the paradigm shifts of Beshalach. Major steps along the road to Sinai. Just remember, we're talking about from slavery to sanctuary, this progression in the book of Shemot. Where are we in the Parashat Beshalach? And the key to understanding where we are on Parashat Beshalach is the key to understanding the Sedra as a whole and why we have these other bits that we just mentioned. Here are the opening words of the Sedra. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the land of the Philistines, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road towards the Red Sea, more properly known as the Sea of Reeds. Now, think about this for a moment. Joseph's brothers went from Canaan to Egypt. They went back. They returned to Egypt a second time. They went back. They returned a third time. It wasn't such a big deal. I'm sure it wasn't that quick, but it wasn't such a big deal. So why couldn't have God allowed them to take the route that Joseph's brothers took? What's the problem with that? And that has to be on our minds as we go into the first part of the parasha, but as we'll see, not only. So we understand for some reason God did not lead the people to the promised land by the direct route. And on this, Rabbi Sachs Zatzal asked a number of questions, and I want to cite 3 of them. Number 1, if God wanted them to avoid war, and that's what the verse said, lest they see war and want to go back to Egypt. If God wanted them to avoid war, why did he provoke the Egyptians to give chase and wage war? Verse says, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart and he will pursue them. Number 2, if he wanted to avoid the Israelites asking to return to Egypt, this didn't happen. What did they say? I always say about this, the first Jewish sarcasm, were there no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. And finally, God wanted them to avoid war with the Philistines. Well, they didn't avoid war. First the Egyptians, but at the end of the Sedra with the Amalekites. At the end of Beshalach, the Israelites are again attacked, this time by Amalek. And this time they fight and they win. They did face war. So why not go via the Philistine country in the first place? But fight with the Philistines instead of the Amalekites. So these are the questions posed by Rabbi Sachs. And he quotes 2 historical parallels. Number 1, Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. This is quite an amazing thing. I'm sure many of you know the story, but just in case, Julius Caesar at one point was the governor of a certain part of the Roman Empire, not including Rome. It was northern Italy and part of Gaul, Gaul. And he had a term of being a governor. And then his term was up. Does this sound familiar? Anyway, his term was up and he was ordered to relinquish his position and return to Rome. He didn't want to do that. And he was told, whatever you do, you will stay one particular side as a governor with your army of the Rubicon River. And he decided this is his moment. He is going to launch a coup. And he took his army and they crossed the Rubicon. In so doing, he had committed treason. There was no going back. That is the story of Julius Caesar and his soldiers. They crossed the Rubicon. They knew they'd either win or they would all die. And they won, as we know. So that's the first thing. The second parallel, in 1519, there was a Spanish commander by the name of Cortés, called Cortés, however you say his name, engaged in the conquest of Mexico. And after they landed, he burned the ships that carried his men, also to say win or die. And you know what? In Beshalach, the same thing. Moshe said to the people, have no fear. Al tira'u, says the Hebrew text. Hityatzvu, stand still. I witness the deliverance which the Lord will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see again. Why were they not led by way of the Philistines? Because the Egyptians had to perish at the sea in order for the Jews to move on, for Bnei Israel to move on. No going back, beyond the point of no return. Had they gone the way of the Philistines, they could have seen war and said, we're going back to Egypt. Well, they'd already come through the sea. They were the other side. They saw Amalek. They had no choice. They had to fight. There's no going back. So here's Rabbi Sachs' comments, further comments. That is what crossing the Red Sea was for the Israelites. And that's why it was essential they experienced it at an early stage in their journey. It was the point of no return. They could only move forward. And he said more than this. I believe that some of the greatest positive changes in our lives come when, having undertaken a challenge, we cross our own Red Sea and we know there's no way back. There's only a way forward. And it's at that point that God gives us the strength to fight our battles and win. We've all been in situations, difficult situations, where we know there's no way going back. The only way is forward. And that was the message that the Israelites received at the sea. Now, let us zoom out and look at the Seder as a whole, because as we indicated earlier, it's not quite clear why these other things are part of the same piece as the splitting of the sea. So here's the structure of Beshalach. Number one, there's a war with Egypt. You see God fights and the people sing. Number two, they go for 3 days and there's no water. Then they come to bitter waters of Marah and the waters are sweetened. We'll look at that more in a moment. And then we get to see there's food, manna and the Shabbat. Manna is going to fall every day, not on Shabbat. Shabbat is introduced as a way of life. Again, quoting Rabbi Sachs, it is the Jews who introduced to this world the concept of a week, a 7-day week. You know, the cycle of the sun and the calendar, and the moon and the calendar. Other civilizations undertook those. Our calendar, by the way, is of course a combination of the two. But the week, that is, it's not a Jewish invention. God invented it, but he told the world about it through us. The fourth main item in the Seder is, again, water. Moses hits the rock. This time, and people confuse the two, he was told to hit the rock. We'll see more about that later. And finally, we end up with another war, the war with Amalek. Big difference between that and number A at the top is that this time the people fight and they win. What's the difference between the two wars? What's happened in between? But look at this structure. It's called a chiastic structure, where you've got A, B, C, B, A, where the A's parallel each other and the B's parallel each other, both about water. And then the C in the middle, you've got manna and Shabbat. Hugely significant. That is the structure of Beshalach. But how do we understand it? Let us remind ourselves. We're going back to the sea for a bit now. The Yad Chazakah, we've spoken about this the last few weeks. The reluctant Israelites, God had to cause Pharaoh to drive us out. What then happened? The Egyptians gave chase, and as Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites caught sight of the Egyptians advancing upon them, and greatly frightened, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. Vaitzaku el Hashem, and litzok is understood to mean in prayer. They are praying to God. The very next verse says, they said to Moshe, we've referred to this before, were there no graves in Egypt that you brought us to die in the desert? What have you done to us, taking us out of Egypt? And the Ramban in his commentary says like this. There is no way that the people who turn to God in prayer at this very difficult time, with the same mouths that they pray to God, are going to turn around to Moshe and condemn him for taking us out of Egypt. Ramban says it just can't be like that. There has to have been two groups, and he quotes a midrash that says there were actually four different groups, that the people were divided. Here's the threat coming towards us. How do we deal with it? But he says in the main there were two approaches. One is to reach out spiritually, and the other is to say, is to criticize, and even if they were in the right, there's not much point in saying, I told you so, because there they were in a dangerous situation. Be that as it may, the Ramban picks up a certain thread through Beshalach. And on the whole, it works, but I've seen some exceptions. Where it refers to Bnei Yisrael in Beshalach, it refers to, if you like, the more spiritually inclined. Where it refers to Ha'am, simply the people, it's those who've got a lot of work to do in terms of their connection with God. And it was they who turned to Moshe at this time. It was they who Pharaoh drove out of Egypt, because the more religious among them understood they have to leave Egypt. They need to go. They want to go. So these two groups seem to be at odds with each other and at their approach at this terrible moment of crisis. And that is how the Ramban explains it. Other commentaries pick up this theme of two groups in other ways. Just look at these two verses. They seem to be saying the same thing. One wonders why the repetition, but on a closer look, there are differences. Look at them. The first one. Vayavo v'nei Yisrael b'toch hayam v'yabasha. The Israelites came into the sea on dry ground. V'hamayim lahem choma miminam mismolam. The waters were for them a wall on their right and on their left. Second verse. Uvnei Yisrael halchu v'yabasha b'toch hayam. The children of Israel went on the dry land in the midst of the sea. V'hamayim lahem choma miminam mismolam. And the water was for them a wall on the right and on the left. It's saying the same thing, isn't it? We'll look at a couple of differences. In the first verse, and I've highlighted this in bold, the word wall, and in English it's the same, but in the Hebrew, the word choma has a vav. The second verse, the word choma, does not have a vav. In the first verse, it says that the Israelites came into the sea on dry ground. The second verse, it says they went, first of all, it doesn't say they came, it says they went on dry ground through the sea or into the sea. The order is reversed. The order is reversed. So the Vilna Gaon and the Kli Yakar, both in their commentaries, say as follows. They also refer to two groups. They say that when it says they came in, the first verse, they came into the sea on dry ground, what that means is they actually came into the sea. Moshe said, God said, keep going. They kept going. They went in. There's a midrash which says, Nachshon ben Aminadav, the prince of the tribe of Judah, was jumped in. Others say he was prince of the tribe of Benjamin, but be that as it may, went in and the water came deeper and deeper and deeper, right up to the nostrils. And only then did the waters part. And there were others like him who came quite close to him, and they were the ones who had the greater faith. God said, go, they went. The others stood back and said, I'm not going in there. You mad? And they waited. What did they wait for? They waited till there was a clear passage and that the ground was dry. About them, it says they came on the dry ground in the sea. They waited till the ground was dry. That's why the order is reversed. For the first group, the waters were a wall, both sides. A wall of water, but two walls. For the second group, also. So why is the Vav missing? So these two commentaries say, you know why? Because if you take away the Vav, you can read Chema. Chema means anger. As it were, the walls of the water were angry with the stragglers who waited behind for their lack of faith. And that helps us to understand a verse in Psalms. If you look at Psalms 106, it's an amazing recapitulation of the Israelite story, our history. And it says that the people rebelled in the sea. And what do you mean they rebelled in the sea? And it's referring, says the Vilna Gaon and the Kliyakar, it is referring to those people who waited for the dry land. So we're talking about two different groups. Just look at those verses again. They came into the sea on dry ground. That's the first group with faith. They got wet. And the waters were a wall, a choma. And the other group, it's on dry ground into the sea. They waited for it to be dry. Without the vav, it could be read as chema, as anger. So clearly, a lot of work needs to be done to get up their faith. And even though it does say that everyone believed at the time when the waters are parted, then closed, drowning the Egyptians, they got away safely. Everyone believed for that moment. But 3 days later, we're into our next incident, and we find that actually there's work to be done. Let's look now at the next 3 items in the parasha. So we said that it begins with war, it ends with war, and there are 3 things in the middle. Here are these 3 things in a little more detail. First of all, water. They're at the bitter waters of Marah. 3 days later, they're thirsty. They need water. And they arrive at water, but they're bitter. And Hashem said to Moshe, take a tree and throw it in. And the waters became sweet. There he set for them a statute and judgment, and there he tested them. The Sham Nisahu. By the way, Nisahu is the same word used regarding Avraham when he was tested with the binding of Isaac. It's a Nisayon. What does the test mean? We'll see in a moment. The second thing, they ran out of food. It's the 15th of Iyar. It's a month later. And absolutely, both the manna and Shabbat, God says, it's in order to test whether they will walk by my Torah or not, in the ways of my Torah or not. Laman anasenu, hayelech b'toratim lo. Again, the word nisayon and the word anasenu. And finally, they come to Refidim and there's no water. And they complain. And the name in the end of the place, of that last place, was called Masar Merivah. They tested God. Here, the testing, if you like, is in the other direction. Is God with us or not? Let's see how these 3 stories play out. First of all, though, to say, remind ourselves, or tell ourselves, there are 2 types of test. The first one mentions the condition of a person, their knowledge, their health. So, knowledge, health. You go to school, you expect to have a test. GCSEs, A-levels. Hopefully they'll return one day. University exams. Those one kind of tests, and with the same group, You go to a doctor for a blood test. What's in it? That's a test of our condition. But there's another kind of test, completely different. And it's this. It's a testing situation. And that challenges a person, allowing them to grow. We are all going through a testing situation at the present time. The virus has been here for a year. We've heard the terrible figures today, number of people who've died from coronavirus in this country. That's an extreme challenge that we're all facing in different ways. But of course, testing situations can occur many different ways. It could be at work, totally physical, it could be emotional, it could be spiritual. So now, let's have a look here. We understand splitting of the sea, drowning the Egyptians, had burned their bridges with Egypt. That's it. But now they need to start growing as people. Just remember, this whole series is called From Slavery to Sanctuary. How are we going to get from one to the other? We started this parasha in a way still as slaves. But now the Egyptians are gone. That's it. Bridges are burned. We're no longer slaves. But what are we? And we need to start growing. And especially the doubters, the ones that said, I'm not going into the sea till it's dry, for example. The ones that complained every time, where there are no graves in Egypt. I'm hungry, I'm thirsty. They need to start growing to prepare them for divine revelation at Mount Sinai. And therefore, God engineered these three tests. Rashbam, who is Rash's grandson, says God is teaching the Israelites that he will provide for them materially, but they need to follow his word. So here's the first of the three, the bitter waters. Just look at the Hebrew. Vayitzak el Hashem, he cried out to God, Vayoreu Hashem eitz. And God showed him a tree. But the truth is, the Vayorehu comes more from the verb lorot, which is to teach. Torah is the same root as Vayorehu. We translate showed him a tree because in a sense that's what he did, but really should have an aleph in it. So he took the tree, he threw it into the water became sweet. And he set there for them a statute and a judgment, and there, as we said before, he tested them. What is he doing? Look at the Rashbam. At Marah, God made them thirst for water, okay, to set up. Then he, as it were, healed the water for them. He began to show them, if they keep the statutes and judgments that he will teach them, he will provide for their needs. But it's very hard not to jump into this concept. What was he shown? Eights. He was taught eights. Where do we know the word eights? Every time we put away the Sefer Torah. It's a verse in Book of Proverbs. Eitz chaim hi lamach hazikim ba. It is a tree of life to those who grasp it. The lesson number one at Marah is that. And water itself is compared to Torah. That's lesson number one. Lesson number two, the manna. So as we said, it's the 15th of Iyar. And they're in the desert between a place called Elim and Sinai. In other words, they are really in the middle of nowhere. And people turn around to Moshe, if only we had died when we sat by the flesh pots. And you know, I'm listening to this year, we're not going to listen to it in shul, but every year I listen to it in shul. And I think to myself, hang on, you just had these amazing miracles. My dear friends, miracles don't change us. We change us, not miracles. So here we go. What are they thinking about in Egypt? We sat by the flesh pots. We ate our fill of bread. If you brought us into this wilderness to starve the whole congregation to death. And Moses said, this is what God has said. Tomorrow is a day of rest. How did he describe it? Shabbaton, Shabbat Kodesh Lashem, a holy Shabbat of the Lord. Bake what you want to bake today. Boil what you want to boil today, Friday. And all that's left put aside to be kept until the morning. So having said to them, don't keep it to the morning, generally the manna. The following, on Fridays, yes, keep. So they put it aside to the morning. As Moses ordered, it did not go off. Moses said, eat it today, for today is the Sabbath of the Lord, Shabbat Hayom Lashem. You will not find manna today. Sheshet Yamim Tukutuhu, Vayom Hashi Shabbat Lo Yebo. 6 days you shall gather it, and on the 7th day, Shabbat, there will be none. This whole thing, manna and Shabbat, it's about food and Shabbat. Collect the manna 6 days a week. Don't leave it overnight. Prepare on Friday for Shabbat, and don't collect on Shabbat. This is a double test. What you should do during the week and what you should not do on Shabbat. And of course, the double portion they collected on Friday is why we have 2 challahs at our Shabbos meals. But this too is another test. Are they going to fall into this routine of manna during the week and Shabbat with an awareness of God, increasing awareness of God? The next one, water. The people thirsted at Rephidim for water, and they grumbled against Moses. Why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? So what did God say to Moshe? Pass before the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel and the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will be standing on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and the water will burst forth, and the people will drink. Moshe and the elders left Rephidim, and they went to where? Horeb, which is another name for Mount Sinai, to demonstrate that the source of the water of the Torah is the source of the water itself. And that is what the Malbim says. So, just think about that. This is a detail that most people miss when they read through. First of all, that this was the occasion Moshe was told to hit the rock. Second of all, he was told to leave the camp. They were at Rephidim, and he was told to take the elders and go for a walk up to Horeb, the site of the burning bush, where in next week's parasha we're going to see the Torah being given. And next week, in the middle of the parasha, we're going to see Bnei Israel leaving Rephidim, where they camp now, and walking to Mount Sinai. What we don't realize is for Moshe and the elders, that's already happened. They are at Mount Sinai. Moshe hits the rock. How does that give them water? Amazing thing. The water forms a stream, goes right down the hill, and flows and flows and flows to Rephidim, into the camp, and they have water. Now, unlike the first 2 incidents, there are no laws brought in here, not a statute or a judgment or Shabbat, nothing. We haven't got that. What we have got is Moshe on the mountain itself. And as we said, water is compared to Torah. The source of divine revelation of Mount Sinai in the Torah is also the source of water. That requires a huge paradigm shift. Get that straight. Sort yourselves out. Move on from Egypt. Getting ready for Sinai. So let's remind ourselves of the whole context of the parasha. So we've now gone through B, C, and B2, and it's in the context with the war with Egypt at the beginning and the war with Amalek at the end. And we ask ourselves, what has changed? That there, the people are prepared to fight. Clearly, one of the things is there's no way back, but it's not as simple as that. Let's have a look then at Amalek. So the very last part of the parasha, Vayavo Amalek vayilachem im Yisrael b'Refidim. Amalek came and fought with Israel at Refidim. They're still at Refidim, where they complained there was no water. Remember, Moshe hit the rock, not at Refidim, but it flowed down to Refidim. So Rashi and other commentators say, what is Refidim? Rafu yadai min haTorah. Their hands had weakened from keeping the mitzvot. What did we say with regard to at Marah? We quoted the verse from Proverbs. Eitz chaim hi lamachazikim ba. It's a tree of life to those who grab hold of it. One wants to be involved in Torah. One needs a bit of, a lot of inner strength. Grab hold of it. But actually their hands had let go of it. And they tested the Lord, saying at Refidim, is the Lord present among us or not? Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu im ayin. So God showed them what it's like when this protection is removed. And what it's like is that he will allow a nation that denies God to attack the people who are now doubtful, is there a God? This is serious stuff. In fact, Rashi brings a well-known midrash. It says, a man carried his son on his shoulder and went on a journey. The son saw something on the ground and he said, Father, pick up that thing and give it to me. Father bent down, picked it up, must have been a very strong father, picked it down, gave it to him. And then there was something else. Father, pick that up, give it to me. Second time, and even a third time. And then after they went on their way a bit further, they saw a passerby coming towards them. And the son said, have you seen my father anywhere? The father was annoyed. He said, don't you know where I am? He put him down on the ground. And at that point, the dog ran up to him and bit him. This is a parable. You know, they've gone through the 10 plagues. They've gone through splitting the sea. The waters have become sweet. Man is falling every day. They even had quails at night. Didn't mention that. Quails at night as well. And then the water came from nowhere, as it were. Moshe hit the rock. Is God among us or not? I'm not sure. To be honest, I'm baffled today after thousands of years of Jewish history and the incredible rise of the state of Israel, which was really beyond miraculous. And people say, I'm just not sure if there's a God. And then they were having open miracles in front of their eyes. So God said, maybe you need to do things a little bit more naturally then. I'll let you be attacked by a nation that denies me. And in fact, the end of the Sedra says that this is a war that's going to be fought through the generations. But let's look at the detail here. We'll come back to what happened in the Battle of Amalek in a moment. But let us now connect the two wars because there is a connecting word, a surprising connecting word which crops up both and therefore frames the entire Sedra. Let's do the top line, which is familiar to us from daily davening. It's the Shira from this week's parasha. When Israel saw the wondrous power, in other words, the big hand that God had wielded against Egypt, Vayiru Hamet Hashem, the people feared God. They were in awe of God. Vayaminu b'Hashem Moshe Avdo. They had faith in the Lord and his servant Moshe. That really meant, to me, to have faith means that they believe that God is faithful to them, and so is Moshe. That's an incredible level of spirituality to reach. Didn't last, but that's where they were. And that's where they sang the Shirah, they sang the song. Now let's go to the war with Amalek. And a surprising word jumps in. Moshe's hands grew heavy. So Moshe was holding up his hands. So they took a stone, I put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur, one on each side, supported his hands, and his hands remained steady. What's the word? Emunah. Faithful. Till the sun set. And Rashi says, Vahi Adav Emunah, his hands were faithfulness. Why does the Torah use that word? More accurate would be Eitan. Steady, but faithful hands. And he says, Moshe's hands were spread forth to heaven in a confident and firm prayer, and that gave the people confidence. Actually, there is a Mishnah, well-known Mishnah in Rosh Hashanah, which says, and it was when Moshe held up his hands, so this is from the Torah, Moshe held up his hands, prevailed, and when he lowered his hands, Amalek prevailed. So in the Mishnah it says, could the hands of Moshe win a war or lose a war? Rather, comes to tell you, whenever Israel looked upwards and committed their hearts to their Father in heaven, they prevailed. And if not, they fell. And it was Moshe's job as leader to remind them that constantly by having his hands held high, but they were held emunah, faithfulness. And this is something which is really incredibly powerful, because to be faithful or to regard something as faithful is a spiritual level. In other words, the whole of Beshalach is really geared towards putting this idea of faith into people. Let's take this idea a little bit further. There's an astonishing verse, easily missed, but it's the end of the Shirah. And it says like this, the end of the Song of Moses, Tivienu v'tuteimu b'har nachlatecha, machol l'shivtecha pa'alta Hashem, mikdash Hashem korenu yadecha. You will bring them. This is a prophecy. The people were so spiritual, says the Midrash, they had incredible levels of prophecy at that moment at the sea. You will bring them and plant them in the mountain of your heritage, the place that you made for your dwelling, O Lord. The sanctuary, Mikdash. Here it is, Mikdash, Beit HaMikdash. O Lord, which your hands established. They foresee this is the people that is going to come into the land and build a Beit HaMikdash. My dear friends, we're talking about from slavery to sanctuary. Here it is. Sort of. Here is the vision. But now you have to get to the vision. How are they going to get there? So Beshalach began with the newly released slaves being attacked. And they're saved, they sing, and they have this prophetic vision. And there's no going back. But there is hard work to turn the vision into reality. And that is what begins now. And what happens now? They now have to realize that vision. They understand that the Torah can even turn bitter water sweet. After all, we're not sure if the waters were bitter or they were bitter. It's not clear from the text. We move on. The manna and the rhythm that's going to establish within the people. 6 days you gather manna. 7th day, Shabbat, no gathering manna. That will be replaced by 6 days you'll work, and 7th day, Shabbat. Same idea, different context going forward. And then, of course, water being compared to Torah, that the water flows down from Mount Sinai. All these are incredible lessons. And even the war with Amalek. The way to prevail against Amalek, sometimes we have to fight wars. It's never what we want, but sometimes there's no choice. And here, there was no choice. You fight a war. But when you do, your hearts go to your Father in heaven. You said the word emunah. In the Israeli army today, training exercises are called imunim. It's the same word. So to achieve emunah, faith in God, requires a lot of training. To be ready to receive the Torah at Mount Sinai requires huge training. That's what Beshalach is about. It starts, but it doesn't end with the splitting of the sea. And that is why even the story of the bitter waters is included in the Torah reading on Pesach, because it's not something that ends there. And in Beshalach, we include story after story after story. You wonder what's it got to do with the first part? We now understand it has everything to do with the first part. The first part is burning the bridges with Egypt. That's not enough. Okay, you're free. Now what? Now grow as a nation, but also as individuals within that nation. So they're about to leave Rephidim. How has it worked for them? Did they grow? Are they ready for Sinai? Is there something else maybe that needs to happen? We'll take a look at that next week. And thank you for joining. And we hope and pray for better news between now and next week. And all the very best.
Thank you.